Hello, welcome to CrossCurrents, produced by the City of Fort Collins in cooperation with the Larimer County League of Women Voters. I'm Barbara Rutstein, the moderator for today's program. Our topic is GMOs in our food supply, risks and benefits. One of the issues on our statewide ballot this year asked voters to require foods containing ingredients made from genetically modified crops to be labeled produced with genetic engineering. Many voters probably heard about GMO foods labeling during the election for the first time. The information on the subject was charged with provocative claims on both sides. In our program today, we hope to have an open discussion to explain what genetically modified crops are, how they impact our food supply, and their benefits and risks. Thus, the next time the issue comes up, we will be better informed voters. To discuss this complex issue, we have on my right Dr. Garry Auld, Professor of Food Science and Nutrition at Colorado State University. On his right is Stephen Hoffman from Compass Natural. On his right is Dr. Patrick Byrne, Professor of Plant Breeding and Genetics at Colorado State University. And on his right is Richard Seaworth, President of Seaworth Farms Incorporated. Welcome to you and to our viewing and studio audiences. First, let's find out who these people are and what their interest is in this topic. Let's start with Richard and just go along, a very brief explanation of who you are and your interest in this.
Well, thank you, Barbara. I thank you and Moretta for inviting me down. It's very difficult for us to get across how we grow crops, and we think it's important that the people know. So we've been in the farming business here for about 90 years. My grandfather started his west of town. I grew up on the same farm I'm on now. My dad purchased it in 1945 before I was born. We're still there. We're very big in sustainable farming. We now farm about 2,000 acres. My son, Troy, who's a graduate of Kansas State University in agronomy and plant sciences, he's back running the operation today, and so that gives me a little time off. But we grow on our 2,000 acres about 450 acres of organic. So I'm going to be on kind of both sides of the subject here tonight. Last year we grew 450 acres of non-organic, but farmed conventionally. And then we grew 1,100 acres of GMO crops, and that's sugar beets and corn. Those are the only two GMO crops we grow. I'm glad to be able to come down tonight because we have had a lot of, not side by side, but farm to farm comparisons and why we do it, and I'll be glad to go into that later. So thank you for inviting me.
Okay. Patrick?
Thank you, Barbara, and I commend your group for having a forum on this topic. I teach and conduct research on plant breeding and genetics, especially wheat, canola, and pinto beans. I have done research on GM crops, both assessing benefits and risks, so I like to be aware of the whole spectrum of opinions and impacts of the technology. And I'll just say one of my interest is not just production here in the U.S., but globally. I've spent about 10 years working overseas, and it's something I try to keep in mind is how are we going to provide enough food, not just for today's population, but the population in 2050?
Okay. Stephen?
Hello, and thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I live in Boulder County, a town called Longmont, but I am from the East Coast, and I received a master's degree in agriculture and entomology from Penn State University, one of the leading land-grant universities in our country, along with Colorado State University. So very excited to be here. My bent is I'm very much an advocate for organic and sustainable food and agriculture, and we can talk about why as we move forward.
Okay, and Garry?
Well, thank you also, and I happen to be a Penn State grad myself. So, as Barbara mentioned, I'm in the nutrition department, so a lot of my research interests have to do with food security, so do the poor get enough to eat, and also diets that promote health. And so when I look at GM or organic or other innovations in the food system, number one, I step back and try to look at the big picture. What are the challenges in the food system that we're facing now? And then how does GM or organic or whatever address those challenges? And as many of you know, the food system is one of the major contributors to greenhouse gases and climate change. It's a major water polluter. Our food supply contributes to many chronic diseases. And we right now have about 1 billion people in the world that are malnourished and another 1 billion that are marginally malnourished, including 50 million people in the United States that are food insecure. So when I look at either GM or organic and these other things, I try to think about how does it affect the poor, how does it affect the environment, and how does it affect people's health. And I think when we talk about GM, it's not a blanket good or bad. You have to look at each application and weigh it, each application on its own merits and see how it does affect these various issues.
Okay, that's pretty good. I think you can see that we have a distinguished panel and a knowledgeable one. Patrick, let's start with the plants. What is the difference between a genetically modified seed and a conventionally bred seed?
Okay, genetic modification or genetic engineering, those are really the same thing.
Okay, good.
Involves using a set of laboratory techniques called recombinant DNA technology. And what that means is techniques for isolating genes, for splicing them, putting them together, and inserting them into plant cells. The power of the technology is that virtually all living creatures use the same language of DNA to control gene expression and protein and traits. And so it's very possible to take a gene from a bacterium or a different plant and put it into one of our crop plants, and that gene will function. There's a lot of trial and error, but it really opens up the repertoire of genes that can be used for crop improvement.
So that's a genetically engineered seed.
That's right.
Now, what happens with conventional breeding?
For
What's
conventional,
the difference?
yes, for conventional breeding, the variation is introduced by crossing plants that are related to each other. There has to be a pretty close relationship, either within the same species or the same genus, for plants to cross-fertilize. So it's a more limited palette of genes that are available for crop improvement.
Okay, anybody want to add to that?
I would like to add to that. What's interesting about the difference between plant breeding and genetically engineering plants is that farmers over time, 10,000 years, and it's getting quite scientific, have selected for the traits that they want to see. And they select it through generations of seeds. Now, only in the past 30 years, which is not a very long period of time, you have a brand new technology in its infancy. It's in its infancy, and yet it's in 85% of our grocery products today. And what they do is they take the DNA from a bacteria or a virus, and they'll insert it into a corn gene or a soy gene so that that plant then produces its own insecticide. Some say, well, that saves us from spraying insecticides in the environment, but others say, well, but now that insecticide is in the corn that we're eating. And in fact, at the University of Sherbrooke in Quebec, medical researchers found that that Bt toxin is appearing in the fetal tissue of unborn babies and also in pregnant mothers who just eat corn. So that's something that safety studies have never been conducted on. And I also want to address one other issue. It also is a way in the laboratory where they take a shotgun kind of approach of shooting these genes in, and you did hear trial and error approach. There's a lot of error. and some of it is swept under the rug. And when they come out and say this is very precise technology, it's not. But my big question gets into some ethical questions as well, and
Wait,
that
let's
is...
get to that later, okay?
Okay.
Okay?
But I do want to close by saying that genetic engineering will combine the genes of species that would never get it on in nature. So we are entering an entire new chapter here that there has been no long-term studies about.
Okay, what about, Pat, do you agree with that?
Well, there were many things said.
I know.
So, which part don't
we
I
kind
agree
of
with?
jumped ahead, so let's
Yeah.
say.
Okay. I will say there is a long and rigorous evaluation process. And perhaps you know that there are 3 federal agencies that do supervise the evaluation of the food safety, environmental safety, and agricultural safety of the products.
Okay, and Mr. Farmer, Richard, do you have any comments on that?
Well, not really, because that comes to us in a different format
Okay.
than what I deal with, so.
Okay, well, someone explained to me the difference between what we're doing now and the Green Revolution. Was that a GMO process or hybrid? What, selective breeding? How did that come
Selective
about?
breeding, right?
Yes, I guess I could address that unless you want to, Gary.
Well, you both can. It's fine.
Right. It was basically using genes for semi-dwarf stature of wheat and rice plants. And these were naturally occurring genes. In wheat, they came from Japanese strains that happened to be dwarf because of natural mutation. And they were bred into the plants. The benefit was reducing the height of the plants, so reducing the vegetative matter in favor of the grain. So it really shifted what we call the harvest index, the proportion of a plant that can be harvested for food.
Okay, but was that genetic engineering? Was it a hybrid or selective breeding? I mean,
Yeah.
compare that for me.
It was conventional breeding.
Okay.
They were major genes that were known, and they were crossed, by hand pollination, and then selected for the dwarf habit.
Okay, so not exactly in a laboratory by inserting DNA or any of that.
That's right.
Okay. Now, how do the plants differ from conventionally bred plants?
The GMO plants?
Yes.
Well, they don't differ much on the outside. It's the DNA that's different, and they express different genes. In the case of BT corn, it's expressing an insecticide. And with the Roundup Ready or that type of thing, they can resist the herbicides, so they're not destroyed by the herbicide, which then allows the farmers to spray the herbicide and control weeds better, at least in the short term.
Okay. So why don't you tell us, Patrick, since you have a slide up, of the crops that are genetically engineered?
Right, and this is something that many consumers seem to be surprised by, that the number of species that are commercialized in the U.S. that are genetically engineered are really very few. There are 8 shown on that slide, and the bars represent the proportion of the acreage in the U.S. of that crop that are planted to GM varieties. So from the left, there's cotton, and then sugar beet, soybean, corn, and canola. So all of those are 90% or more of all the acreage in the U.S. is planted to GM varieties. And then there are smaller proportions of papaya, alfalfa, and summer squash that are relatively minor.
Okay.
The result of this, even though it's a small number, some of those are really big acreage crops. And corn, soybean, and canola end up in a lot of food products. And so the figures I've seen are 60 to 70% of processed food products have some ingredient that is from a GMO crop.
Okay. Now, Richard, as a farmer, why would you want to grow a GM crop versus a conventional crop? You said you have both.
Okay, well, the main reason we go to GMO is for, I guess, the big reason's water. GM crops take a lot less water than normal crops, and let me explain why that is. When we have a crop growing, there's weeds are our biggest enemy. There's only, in our organic farming, there's only one way to take care of the weeds, and that's through tillage. Every time you till the soil, you have evaporative loss. And we did quite a little study on this before we started growing as much GMO as we have. And on a normal year, it takes 13 tillage processes to grow an acre of corn organically. Genetically modified, we can do that with 5 operations. That saved us 6 acre inches in 2011. So if you take our 1,700 and our 1,750 acres that we're farming conventionally, that comes out to saving us 775 acre feet of water a year that we just flat don't have. That's one of the reasons some of our farms are organic, some of our farms are non-organic, because that's the big difference there. Now, we can grow non-GMO, and there's a big difference there. The GMO saves us water, it saves us tillage practices, which also saves us fuel, which that becomes on our organic process a problematic thing for me, because when I'm burning an extra 11 gallons of fuel to the acre a year, I'm leaving a much larger carbon footprint than I am without that. So that tells me that I may be causing a problem that I don't really want to have. But I'm in favor of all 3, or we wouldn't be doing it. So, but that's the main reason. We also don't have to handle the insecticides and the herbicides that we have. It bumps our yield up. Our yields in prior to GMO on sugar beets was running about 5,800 pounds of sugar per acre. And now we're up to a little over 9,800 pounds of sugar per acre on the average for the last 3 years. So it bumps your yield quite a bit. So when you take the amount of water per, not only per pound of sugar, it almost doubles that. So that's the reason we do it. And it's not because somebody just come out and said, hey, why don't you try this? I actually was lucky enough to be involved. I sit on the Colorado Sugar Beet Growers Board, and so we went through that transition from non-GMO seed in our sugar beets to the GMO. And sitting on the board, we had people from various universities across the country. We grew our different samples of GMO besides non-GMO. We had them sent to Cornell and Kansas State and Nebraska and various universities, UC Davis. Come back and tell us what the difference is here, because we have a customer to worry about out there, so we need to make sure that whatever we're doing, and every one of them come back and said there is virtually no difference here. There's some difference in the pulp, but there's no difference in the sugar at all. So that's kind of the reason we went into this. Start with is there's really, for a consumer to tell it is, nobody can tell. Now corn, there's some tests they can do, so that's okay, but in the sugar industry, it's very difficult for us because there's no difference.
Okay, any other comments on that?
Well, how long have you been doing the sugar beets?
Well, since 1920, so.
No, but I mean the GMO sugar beets.
I think, I think the first year was like 2006, if I remember right.
But you still do both?
No, the sugar beets, we only grow genetically modified sugar beets.
Oh, okay.
All the sugar beets are genetically modified.
Okay, Stephen?
My question would be, okay, you're controlling weeds mechanically in organic, and you're saying that releases moisture. You're not controlling weeds mechanically in the GMO fields. You're applying pesticides. So
No, sir.
it's a trade.
Herbicides.
Pesticides, I want to make something very clear because I do have a degree in entomology, and that's pest control in agriculture. Pests are defined as insects and weeds. So you have two kinds of pesticides. You have insecticides, like BT, like malathion, like neonicotinoids that are actually contributing to our honeybee colony collapse. And then you have herbicides. And some herbicides, and I will also posit that Roundup, though we hear that it's benign, is actually not benign at all. And in the quantities that are being applied on our hundreds of millions of acres of agriculture are actually contributing to environmental and human and animal health problems. So I think it's a trade that you might be saving tillage, but you're applying more pesticides. And what I will posit, based on studies that have been done by the Organic Center and by University of Washington, is that initially the herbicide usage in GMO crops in the 90s decreased because it was pretty miraculous. But just like the overuse of antibiotics, you have the resistance developing in disease. The same thing is happening with weeds in our country due to the overuse of herbicides. And actually, due to that, 400 million more pounds of herbicide is used in genetically engineered agriculture compared to just conventional agriculture, not even compared to organic agriculture. The weeds are getting so resistant to Roundup that now Dow has got approved a new soybean, or is it corn variety? I'll have to check my notes, where they can now use a combination of Roundup and an herbicide called 2,4-D. Now, if you're a Vietnam veteran, you might remember 2,4-D is actually Agent Orange, and they used it as a defoliant in Vietnam, and it had caused untold health conditions among many, many veterans. So now we're going to be spraying Roundup and Agent Orange, 2,4-D, on millions of acres of our crops in America. So GMOs have turned from reducing the use of herbicide to now actually increasing the use of toxic synthetic pesticides in our environment.
Okay? Sure.
Been 2,4-D here since the 50s. That was the very first herbicide we ever used. If you take our land that we farm conventionally, but non-GMO, we use more pesticides that we have to handle in our sprayers. We use more herbicides. We use more insecticides, and we have to handle all those. Those sacks end up in the landfill. Some of that can end up in the water. So that becomes an issue because we have a hungry world to feed, and that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to poison anybody. So, but if you want to make sure you stay away from this, and I'm okay with that because otherwise I wouldn't grow organically. That's how you do that, because we go through a very rigorous routine, and we're inspected several times a year to make sure that we don't use any of those things. And I'm just pointing out the things that we will have to quit farming a lot of our ground if we have to go back to organic, because there's just not enough water here to do it. We don't have enough equipment to do it, and we don't have enough labor. Because in Larimer County, there's no labor camps. So when we bring labor in to work in our organic fields, they have to come in out of Weld County. So that's also a huge carbon footprint, I'll tell you.
Sure. Now, one of the things that I don't understand, you say one thing, and then we haven't heard from the professors yet, but I read an article that said the U.S. Department of Agriculture found pesticide use on corn crops has dropped 90% since the introduction of BT corn. And so I don't know where this all comes from.
For a lot of these studies, you have to look at, was the study done within the first 3, 4, or 5 years of the introduction of GMOs, or is it
Okay.
done after 6, 8, 10 years? And the resistance takes 3 to 6 years to start showing up. So
Okay.
I think he's right that there's an increased use of pesticides. Roundup is becoming, there's so many weeds that are resistant to Roundup now. It's not just the 2,4-D that's been approved, it's atrazine and dicampa if that's how you
Okay.
pronounce it. So other more toxic pesticides are now going to be used very heavily in agriculture. And I agree, there's a trade-off. There's always a trade-off. So is it the water or is it the pesticide? But there's going to be something that you're going to have to pay. You're going to pay one way or the other for the crops. And personally, I don't see the advantage of putting 1 billion pounds of pesticides in the environment on an annual basis and how that is sustainable. To me, that is unsustainable, and it's going to come back and get us.
Okay, Patrick?
Yeah, I would say that on the net benefit, according to various meta-analyses, National Research Council, is that the amount of pesticide use has decreased, okay, compared to conventional agriculture and non-GM crops. I think in addition to the amount, though, the particular pesticides should be looked at. And compared to many of the alternatives to Roundup, Roundup is relatively benign. It doesn't leach into the groundwater. It decomposes relatively rapidly.
Okay, and in huge operations, what are the alternatives, Steve? I mean, if you have 2,000 acres.
First, I have to challenge this about glyphosate. First, it takes magnesium out of the soil, making it, well, it chelates it. So it makes it unavailable to the plants, and that's how the weeds die. So the corn that they've engineered to be more resistant to massive applications of Roundup is actually also, and I would ask you this, are you finding that GMO corn is deficient in magnesium compared to regular corn? But I want to bring up another point. Glyphosate is not benign, and it does, according to an August 2011 study by the United States Geological Survey, glyphosate, which is the Roundup that you buy, that you spray your sidewalks, except farmers are spraying it constantly on millions of acres. They're even spraying it on wheat 2 weeks before harvest just to dry up the wheat so they can harvest it easier, but those residues are on the wheat we eat, even though wheat is not GMO. However, glyphosate is consistently found in rain, rivers, surface water, and air throughout the entire growing season in agricultural areas in the entire Mississippi watershed, according to USGS studies released in August 2007 or 11. We are literally drinking, eating, and breathing Roundup with no long-term human health studies. And the massive quantities, again, we have research funded from one source, research funded from another source. Question the source of the funding. But our research shows that in the past 10 years, that herbicide use has gone up 400 million pounds because of GMO agriculture. That is not a decrease of 90%. However, science, when someone tells you science is truth, actually science is a process, and science is debated constantly, all the time, and we're debating it today.
Sure. Any other comments?
I would like to comment on the spraying of the wheat. I've read that email, and I will tell you that the internet loves to pick on GMO. I don't know why it does that, but it does. And I'm not a total fan of it. Excuse me, I can talk on either side of this subject, but for us to go in and spray wheat, and we have done it, it's not done very often because the sprayer knocks down more wheat than you save. It only does if we get into a real weed position, and we've had a lot of rain, which doesn't happen that much. In Kansas, very seldom happens. You get north into North Dakota, that's a little bit more of a price, but it's a very small percentage. And people are trying to say that that's the reason some people can't digest and stuff. That just doesn't seem to be true because we have the same place. We grow organic wheat, and we get those same kind of complaints from people with our organic, and I guarantee you that is not sprayed. Also, the super weeds that we're talking about, weed resistance. If you'll notice, we raise several different crops. We raise sugar beets, and we raise corn, we raise alfalfa, we raise wheat, we raise pinto beans, black beans. All of those have a different type of herbicide that we use. We don't use, and when we're using Roundup, I want you to know, we have a recommended label rate, and we don't exceed that. And we keep rotating our crops around so that the weeds in these fields do not become resistant to that. It's going to happen to us, I think, eventually, but if we keep our rotation properly and we use different herbicides with different modes of action, we don't get into that. And what happens is you get a thing that works good. Atrazine you mentioned a while ago. I mean, we thought that was the wonderful thing of the year. Well, after 4 or 5 years, our weeds became resistant. Nobody uses it. If Roundup gets to where it's resistant, nobody will buy it. Nobody will use it. So it's going to go completely away as soon as that happens. But those of us who are in the business and we rely upon our land for our living, we're very cautious about trying to rotate our crops and rotate our modes of action and the way we kill these weeds so that we don't get into that. Now, our organic, it stays organic, because once you get into that, that's not something you can get in and out of. That farm has to stay that way. It takes years to get it there to great expense, so.
Okay, what is the evidence on all of this in other places? Patrick? I mean, do people rotate their crops or not really?
Well, it's been a problem for weeds as well as insects. There's been several cases of insect pests developing resistance to BT, partly because of lack of compliance with recommended EPA procedures for setting some of the cropland in a non-BT version of the corn. Farmers are required to set aside somewhere between 5 and 20% of their total acreage to a non-GMO version or a non-BT version. Well, compliance isn't always 100%. So there have been cases of resistance developing, and in some cases, not all farmers are as responsible as you are, Richard, with the use of Roundup Ready. And unfortunately, they follow one Roundup crop with another one, with another one, with another one.
And you know, that is the way we've done it in the past. But we have new generations out here now that have went to universities, and I mean, my son come back out of Kansas State, and that's just not the way he's going to do business. So a lot of things have changed, and you know, I like my dad used to say, in order to make a lot of these things change and work, you got to have some funerals, and so that's kind of what we have to do. We have to get the younger generation in there to make these new things work, and it's not something you can just turn everybody loose with. That's for sure.
There were actually studies conducted by Dow Chemical, also Syngenta, and Monsanto in 2011, where they found that as many as 20 million acres of GMO corn and soybeans may be infested with Roundup-resistant superweeds. Most of that is happening in the southeast, but it's spreading across the country. Farmers have been using Roundup far too much. The weeds are getting resistant, and now they have to use ever more toxic herbicides. Now, organic food and farming, believe it or not, can actually help. This is another subject, but it actually ties up carbon in the soil, takes it out of the air. It takes the pesticides that are being used so heavily. And then you'll get GMO folks say, well, we're using BT just like organic farmers. Well, they're engineering it into the crop. Organic farmers use BT sparingly. The BT insecticide that's engineered into the corn is so prevalent, it's actually getting in humans, it's affecting bees, and it may also lose its potency and develop resistant insects as well. So the problem is we love this stuff so much. Again, I want to go back to the model of antibiotics in medicine. It was the miracle. So we used it so much that now you have antibiotic-resistant staph, and it's very much a case study of what's happening with genetic engineering. The issue is so much money is being invested and government subsidies into genetic engineering and not enough into agriculture that is less reliant on synthetics and also patents. There used to be hundreds of independent seed companies around the world. Now there are 6 seed companies that own 90% of the world's seed stock. And I'll name them for you.
Oh, let's
Monsanto, Dow, Syngenta, Bayer, BASF, and DuPont. Now, they bought up all the seed companies around the world, and guess what those companies are? They are chemical and pesticide companies.
Okay, let's go on to another subject. Does CSU do any research on this? Yeah.
They do.
Uh-huh.
It is not a university policy, it's an independent scientist decision, whether
Okay.
they want to invest time and energy. But I would say people are on all sides of that issue. There are people in trying to develop GM crops and test the ability of crops to be more nutrient efficient, for example.
Uh-huh.
And other people looking at effects on ecological processes.
Okay, and is anyone in food science or nutrition seeing if these various pesticides, insecticides, herbicides are in the food?
Well, they certainly are in the food. If you compare, there's been a number of studies that compared pure organic, so everything they ate was organic versus conventional. And when you're eating organic, you're exposed to very few pesticides, and they don't show up. It's very difficult to find in the urine, for example, the metabolites. And if you look at the conventional, you can find the metabolites almost immediately when they start eating. Now, the issue, though, is not whether the pesticide metabolites are in the urine or you're exposed to, is at what level is it a risk? And that's where it gets very gray. And we can detect pesticides or metabolites at a very, very low level. Is that a health risk? Well, that's not completely clear, but we do know that our exposure to pesticides, unless you're on the farm, is from the food we eat.
From the food, not from the air or the water.
And not unless you're living in a rural environment.
Right, right. Okay. Are there any audience questions at this point? Yes.
I'm asking as someone who knows extraordinarily little about this whole topic, but I'd like to ask Mr. Seaworth, we read about pesticides, herbicides drifting onto organic crops. Could you explain to me why that's not an issue in your farming practices? Because it seems to me that touches on this whole question of what kinds of crops you're growing and what the impact is on our food supplies.
Good question. We get that quite often. The biggest problem can be drift from pollen. The sprayer, we have those pretty well controlled. When we spray minute amounts, and it's expensive, and we're pretty cautious to make sure it goes where it belongs. And so that's not a big issue for us. We don't spray in the wind. You can't afford to do that because you'd probably kill the crop next to it anyway. We have 40 to 80 foot barriers, but then we're very lucky because we have enough of our own land that we can make sure that we don't plant genetically modified corn next to organic corn. For example, this year, our organic corn, we had next to that, we had sugar beets. So there was no chance of any pollen moving because the sugar beet never pollinizes because you don't eat the seed itself like you do in corn. So that's pretty easy to do. And most areas, like we get north of Wellington, there's quite a little organic. We have signs up so when the county sprays, they don't spray the bar pit because they get 40 miles from their shop and they can't just stop. So, and they're very good about that. We don't see that as being an issue at all.
Okay, and I think some places it is. One of the other things I read was that in Australia there are 2 farmers having a legal battle. One of them had a canola crop that blew into a neighboring farmland growing organic oats and wheat. And I don't understand why that would be an issue. They're 2 completely different crops. And the one growing organic oats and wheat lost his export license.
Well, it could be from pesticide drift versus pollen drift. And it just takes a wind, or actually even in California, there was a case where pesticides got caught up in fog. And the fog just sat then, once it moved from the conventional farm, it sat over the organic farm and dropped all the pesticide on the organic farm. And that farmer was not able to sell any of his crop as certified organic. He lost his harvest because of pesticide drift. He won actually a lawsuit in that case. So there is definitely drift, and I'm sure that Richard takes great care to make sure he doesn't spray on windy days. But if he does spray on a windy day, there is the risk.
Okay,
But
Patrick?
Barbara, I think in the case you're talking about, there must have been some organic canola as well. Because I think I remember this case, and it wasn't just a matter of canola pollen on wheat and oats,
Okay,
but it was cross-pollinating the organic canola as well.
And that very well could be.
One thing I would like to mention, when you spray Roundup, it doesn't volatilize. 2,4-D volatilizes something terrible. That's one of the reasons we've went away from it. And what I mean by that is you spray it, and then as the heat comes on, it vaporizes and comes up, and then it moves. So, and you can get into that very easily. We're very lucky because the neighbors around us don't use any 2,4-D. So, and we kind of cooperate with the neighbors and they do with us so that we try not to get into that situation. And Colorado has a very good, the state of Colorado does all our certifications, and they have a very good guidebook, and we work very well throughout the area to do that. And so that's something that can be a problem if you're not aware of what you're doing, and if it's like the first year you ever grew things, these kind of things happen.
okay, let's go a little bit international now. Some of the articles I read also said that for food insecure nations, and you brought this up, Garry, they've been able to grow a lot more crop, rice in particular, I guess, and other kinds of foodstuffs that they need there. So how do we deal with that?
No, there's no GMO rice.
It's in the works, but there is no commercially approved GMO rice to date.
Okay, well, what is it then? I did read about it. What about Swarma Sub 1 rice?
Right, that is a non-GMO variety.
That's a
That is-
non-GMO variety.
It is. It's submergent tolerant, and it's been a big success.
Yes.
And it's created through some biotechnology research, but conventionally crossed and bred.
Oh, okay.
This is what's, it can be submerged for 2 weeks
Yes,
and still
yes,
survive.
yes.
So this would be in flood
Flood
prone
tolerant
areas.
rice,
right?
yes, yes. And then I guess there are drought tolerant crops too.
There is one drought-tolerant corn hybrid that's been released in the U.S.
Yeah, I'm talking about worldwide in
It is
India. I
GMO.
think in India is what this article was about, that they've been able to double their output and increase their income tremendously.
Right, and I think that is conventional plant breeding that you're
Oh.
referring to.
Okay, well, that's better then, I guess.
Well, maybe. There are, the last I read, 27 countries that grow GM crops.
Uh-huh.
Not very many in Europe, but
No.
quite a few in Latin America, and
Yes.
a growing number in Africa and Asia.
Yes, yes. Okay, well, and the article I read about Africa was the idea of, instead of using GM crops, it was to not have a single crop, but to grow a lot of other things.
Biodiversity.
Yes,
That's, I think, a big issue because the GM crops are all monoculture.
yes,
And the monoculture drives insects, drives weeds, and if you can grow a biodiverse operation, you have less pressure from the insects and less pressure from the weeds. Now, a very large operation, it's more challenging to do that, but if we're talking about the third world, most of the food in the third world is grown by small farmers using biodiverse operations. And if we would support them, I think we'd have a better chance of addressing food insecurity than having large monoculture approach that we use in the United States. But you get
Okay.
more food per acre with the biodiverse, more total food with biodiversity than a monoculture.
Yes, I think they were talking about cassava farmers that just had cassava, and then when they had some kind of a virus, they lost their crop and they were hungry, and then they gave them some other options to use.
But I would take issue with assertion that GMOs are by nature monoculture. You could have a BT cassava plant, for example, grown in a mixture of cowpeas and other crops as well.
You never do.
Well, there is none, but monoculture should also be considered over time. I mean, if you grow corn year after year in your Iowa farm, that is the worst type of monoculture. But if you rotate with wheat and oats and soybeans, that is a diverse agriculture if you look over a 5 and 10-year period.
But I would posit, Pat, that you are very correct, and yet this system of GMO seed, and farmers can't save their seed anymore. They have to buy it year after year, has created this situation in Iowa where it's just corn from road to road. There's actually not even room for milkweed anymore, so the monarch butterflies are going extinct because of this fence row to fence row genetic engineering agriculture with no crop rotations, not one single milkweed for them to eat. So we are getting into a situation where this agriculture that is being foisted upon us by a handful of corporations is impacting our biodiversity, our ecology, our animal species, our environment, and there have been no long-term human health studies beyond 90 days ever conducted. The only study that was conducted for the length of time that rats live was discredited by political maneuvering. And in that study, the rats developed cancers and tumors from eating GMOs their entire lifetime. We do want to talk about the safety of GMOs in terms of health. Right now, I've been focusing on all the pesticides that they're selling with their GMO seeds that they're dousing our country with. And in fact, in Argentina, where there's very little policing and GMO agriculture is huge in Argentina, the local farmers, the populace are being poisoned. And if you Google Associated Press, Argentina pesticides, GMO, you will be amazed at the expose article that was just published. We are not even hearing about how GMOs are affecting people in developing countries.
Okay, now I have to go back to my little bit of reading. And there was a Scientific American article that said the European Commission funded 130 research projects carried out by more than 500 independent teams on the safety of GMO crops. None of the studies found any special risks from GM crops. So,
how long were those studies done for, and who funded them?
well, they weren't in the European Union. They weren't funded by the seed companies, that's for sure.
They very well could have been.
Oh, I don't think so. They're
do
very
think so.
anti-GM. Oh,
They're pro-GMO labeling. They're not anti-GM. As a matter of fact, 64 countries around the world require GMO labeling because this is something that these countries feel the consumer should decide. Russia requires GMO labeling. China requires GMO labeling. Japan, Australia, Brazil. The United States, they say because it looks the same, it'd only confuse you to have a label on it, right? So you don't get to make the choice. And that's why 85% of grocery products have GMOs in them, and nobody knows because it's not labeled in the United States. I say we should have the same freedoms as Russia, China, and Syria when it comes to GMO labeling.
Barbara, in the case of the study you mentioned, those
Yes.
were all funded by the European Union. not
yes,
by
that's
seed
what it
companies.
said. I don't
Yep.
know.
Yep.
That's what it says.
Yep.
And I know I don't know which countries, I don't know if I read which countries do or don't allow GMO crop, but I think it's.
Just a few.
Just a few allow them, yes,
Yep.
yes. Okay, do you,
Studies that we have done in the sugar beet industry were paid by us. The sugar beet industry's owned 90%. We own our own processing companies. They're all cooperative. And so we tax ourselves for research. And we have these different universities. And the university people work for the people. They don't work for the seed companies. So we felt like we could trust the universities to do proper testing, and they all came back and told us they couldn't find a bit of difference. And so I feel like that's pretty comfortable. I would also like to comment about his comment that we can't keep our seed. Well, since we've been breeding to single cross seed, and I think you'll understand this very well, we learned 30 years ago not to keep our seed because it doesn't reproduce after the single cross. So that's where this all got started. It didn't get started with GMO. So that's where the issue is. And that's something that's went on, and that was in normal breeding, am I correct?
Yes.
Okay.
It's appropriate for you, but it's not appropriate for farmers in developing countries that traditionally have saved their seed and now they can't because GMO agriculture is being foisted on them. And then they have to buy the synthetic fertilizer and the pesticides to go with it, or the GM crop won't work. I do want to mention about the synthetic nitrogen fertilizer that also is used along with genetic engineering. That fertilizer, you folks read about what happened to the water in Erie, Pennsylvania recently? That it was contaminated with an algae and people couldn't drink their water? That was actually as a result of runoff of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer into Lake Erie that created the toxic algae bloom, and now the water is not potable anymore. It's also as a result of widespread genetic engineering. Have you heard of the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico and other estuaries? Those dead zones are the sizes of states. They're also caused by runoff from synthetic nitrogen fertilizer heavily used in GMO farming.
I think,
We have some livestock operations that have been blamed for this nitrate. So I'm glad to know that they had nothing to do with that it was fertilizer, and they're going to be glad to know
And that
that.
fertilizer all comes from natural gas.
Okay, Patrick, and then we're going to have final remarks.
yeah, I think Steve is really confused between conventional agriculture that uses a lot of pesticides, including synthetic nitrogen, and GMO agriculture.
I think
No, wait,
is-
let him
Is
have
conventional agriculture on
No,
steroids.
you have to let him have his say. Go
Yeah.
ahead, and then we have final
Yeah.
remarks.
Synthetic nitrogen has been used heavily since the 1940s. It is not specific to genetic engineering.
Okay, we are close to 8 o'clock. We're going to have final remarks. And for your final remarks, I would like you to give some advice to Colorado consumers regarding their consumption of products containing GMO ingredients. What would you tell our audience here and our viewing audience if you could give them advice about consuming GMO crops?
Okay, well, thank you, Barbara. My advice would be nothing leaves our farm that I won't eat and my children and my grandchildren won't eat. So I feel pretty safe with it. I do understand that people want to feel better about their food, and if they do, and you want to know that it's non-GMO, you need to buy organic because that's what we do. And if that makes you feel better, it's okay. I really don't believe we're poisoning the world. We have the United States has one of the healthiest, most abundant food supply of any society in history. So, and I'm very proud of that. I worry about feeding this huge population coming up. We need to be able to export more food because the more we can export, the more people won't go hungry. And I'm not sure that we can, I know we can't do it all organically. I wish we could, but we just can't. So thank you for having me here tonight.
Okay, thank you. Patrick?
Okay, I would say if it's something you're concerned about, there are two voluntary labeling options that you can pay attention to. One is certified organic, and the other one is verified non-GMO, alternative way. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, does require labeling for GMO products that have been shown to have increased allergenic, toxic, or altered nutritional profile. So there is provision for mandatory labeling for those types of things. Otherwise, I think you can have confidence in the safety of the food supply. It's been verified, it's been tested. I think we need to continue monitoring, but I don't think you need to pay attention to fearful messages.
Okay, Stephen?
First, there is no mandatory labeling of GMOs, Pat. It's on a voluntary basis, and it's been that way, and there's not one product that's been labeled that contains GMOs since the Flavor Saver tomato came out in 1994. No one would buy it, so they took it off the shelf, and they took it off the label, and they haven't put contains GMOs on the label since. The other thing is he's correct. You can choose organic. You can choose non-GMO project verified. They are voluntary labels. But you also now need to accept that your entire food system other than that is basically genetically engineered. And
What's your advice?
my advice is to choose organic because we actually do have incredible rates of cancer, diabetes, obesity, and other illnesses in our country that are caused by carcinogens in our environment. And I hate to see our food system actually increasing the amount of carcinogens in the environment to the point where they're killing bees, monarch butterflies, and we have no idea what they're doing to us.
Okay. Gary?
Well, I would have mentioned the organic or the non-GMO project, of course. At this point, there's only 5 major crops that are GMO, as Pat has up there, actually. Well, there's 8, but there's 5 that show up in the food supply. So if you want to read ingredients, you can look for soy, corn, canola, and sugar from sugar beets. Although I don't think the issue is the ingredients that are derived from the foods. If we think about what we eat, we don't eat that much GMO directly. We eat animals that eat GMO, which is a little bit different. There's no foods specifically that are at least enlarged in the supply that are GMO. Corn and soy are fed to animals, or our cars is ethanol. Right? So I just think that we need to, as a society, come to grips or question the assumption that the only way to feed the world is to have a chemically monoculture, chemically dependent cropping systems. In my opinion, we cannot, it's not the GMOs that's the problem, it's the environmental impact of the pesticides and the huge amounts of chemicals that we use. We cannot keep doing, and I agree with Steve that there is ample evidence that this is unsustainable.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I hope you've all learned as much as I have, and it's not an easy subject. Thank you to our panelists. This CrossCurrents program will be rebroadcast at various times during the month. Please check your local listings for exact dates and times. Copies of recent CrossCurrents programs are available at all 3 branches of the Poudre River Library District. The video is available at the League of Women Voters website, which is www.lwv-larimercounty.org. Thank you for tuning in.